I work at Bloomsburg University. I'm a professor of instructional technology, and so I teach graduate students to design, develop, and deliver online instruction. And many years ago, got involved in gamification before it was even called gamification, just using game elements in learning to make the learning a little bit more exciting. And I remember when I first brought it to the faculty, and they're like, "Well, we don't design games. We're not going to do this. We're not teaching programming." And I said, "No. We just use parts of games. We're not creating, a whole game." And so years later, we finally kind of got through. And so I've done some writing on that. I've written several books on gamification, and just wrote one on game-based learning, and did several lynda.com courses, and travel around, obviously, talking to people about how to intelligently combine, game thinking, gamification, and learning together to get the results that people want.
You must have seen some amazing patterns working with these different companies, talking to all these different people, coaching all the students that you've coached. What's one of the things you've learned over the last, say, 5 or 6 years about what really makes a compelling experience if what you want to do is make it game-like or gamified?
Right. That's a great question. One of the things that I find that is so interesting to me and so antithesis to what happens in the learning industry is that people really respond well to a challenge. And so what we've done in the online learning industry is we've dummied down instruction. It's so easy that anybody could do it, and there's no challenge. And when there's no challenge, nobody cares about it. And so I find, so my students, for example, one of the things that I do is I put them into teams, and I have them all compete against each other to create a proposal. And right from the beginning, they're engaged with the class because they want to do well, and they have to up the stakes. We have them present in front of 30 corporate advisory council members. So it's not just Dr. Kapp that they're presenting to, it's this group. And so it really raises their focus. It really sharpens what they do, and it really gets them excited. And I found the same thing in the corporations that I work for. I say, well, we don't like this training because of this and this. And I said, well, what if we recast that as a challenge that you have to overcome, or the learners have to overcome? All of a sudden they're like, well, yeah, in fact, I get challenges every day. And so the more real we can make those challenges for them to overcome and work through, we find the more they become engaged. So instead of telling them, well, you need to know this policy because of da-da-da, we say, okay, somebody violated this policy. What policy did they violate? Why did they violate? And what are the repercussions? And that really seems to get people engaged. So I think challenge is a really compelling method. Humans like challenge. The research is pretty clear that challenge leads to motivation and those kind of things. So I think we do ourselves a disservice from the learning and development industry if we decide to make learning not challenging. So I think challenge is a really big thing. And then the other thing is failure, right? So I really believe, and I'm not alone, there's a lot of research that says this, that people learn best when they fail, right? So if you think about what you're learning, if you got something right away, it's not sticking with you, or whatever. But if you failed, and then got the aha moment, that makes a lot of sense. But I mean, I've literally been in organizations where they say, the legal department says, you can't teach them the failure state because or expose them to the failure state, because then people will think we're teaching them how to fail, which is not. It's crazy. How do you know what the wrong thing is if you've never been exposed to it? And how do you get motivated to do the right thing if you don't fail, and then figure out how to do it? Now, I'm not saying fail forever or set people up for failure, but I really believe that and the pattern I've seen is that people really try to overcome failure and then learn lessons from it, rather than just being taught the right way or the right information or the right policy.
That's deeply connected to what we're teaching in game thinking. You have to look for information about what's wrong with your idea as well as what's right with it. That's how you go quickly. And it really is how you learn, and it really is how you prepare your students for the 21st century.
I don't know what they're doing. I don't know how people can survive without dealing with failure. And failure, it really is a motivator. It's an educator, and it's something that focuses your thoughts on the future. So I think failure is a very important part that gets way underplayed.
So can you tell us a story about something that you learned personally from failure, from trying something
Ah,
and seeing, oh, that was maybe not the right thing, or that worked, but this other thing over here, boom, from failure,
no,
right?
no, right. It's not fun. Yeah, and so I have a bunch related to this one process that I was doing. So we had a grant from the National Science Foundation, and it was a team that was put together. I was kind of the designer on the project. There was a programmer, and there was educators. And so we were teaching kids to understand the concept that heat flows from hot to cold. And in ninth grade or sixth grade, it's a concept that you would think is obvious, but it's not. So we developed this really cool thing called Survival Master. So the idea was the kids were learning about dead load and live load and heat exchange and everything through these activities in this game and the series of games, and you were going to become a survival master. So one of the games was this platform, and you had a laser, and you got on the platform, and you had to shoot either the hot side or the cold side, or shoot both of them to move the platform. And it only worked if you shot it correctly from heat flowing from hot to cold. That's how you moved on the platform. And the players had to do that like 6 times to get across this moat-filled room. And we were so excited about it because it was a practical application of really doing hot heat flow. And we were really excited because they had to know that in order to get across the room. So we were really excited to show it to the educators. So we brought them in the room and said, look at this, like heat flows on for. And they looked at it for a while, and they looked at it, and then they said, well, they raised their hand and said yes. And they said, well, how do we know that the students know that heat flows from hot to cold? And I said, well, because otherwise they couldn't get across the room. Like that's how they knew it. And they said, but how do we know they know it? I said, because that's how they get there. And I said, no, we don't think that's enough. And I said, well, okay, well, maybe we'll put like a little coach that comes up and says, hey, congratulations, you made it across the room. You know that heat flows from hot to cold. And they're like, no, that's not going to work. And we said, well, why not? And he goes, we have to ask them the question. And I'm like, are you seriously? And so so at the end, and we had to acquiesce, because it was a national science, and they had to assess it. And so once you made it across the room, there was this giant multiple choice question like floating in the air that you had to answer. You had to answer hot to cold. So that was really kind of disappointing that we couldn't get across the fact that if they actually demonstrated it, that meant that they knew the concept. I mean, the most frustrating thing, Amy, was that these people, they didn't play games. And so when we said, this is a game-based learning, you demonstrate, and they're like, yeah, but it has to be multiple choice, it has to be questions. So to me, that was one of the most frustrating experiences and failure. I mean, the product is sitting on a shelf somewhere collecting dust because we just couldn't move the needle on that.
So now, with the benefit of hindsight, looking back on that, what are you taking into your next projects, the project you're going to start in 6 months or a year?
Right. Yeah,
What
that's a great
lessons
question.
are you taking into that?
Yeah. So the very first lesson that taking into it is to spend time up front educating the stakeholders about what the game learning process is. So these people that didn't play games, who are educators, we should have spent more time educating them about, demonstrating of the knowledge and the content. The second was, we probably pushed back a little bit too hard on the multiple choice question. It's not going to kill somebody to take a multiple choice question. That, although I would still try to do that like outside of the game. So to say to them, okay, now that they've done this experience in the game, let's do something outside of the game. And then the other thing is we should have got more educators across the state involved earlier so that they could become vested in this particular product. So
And become
we brought it to them.
co-creators.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we came down from on high with the magic tablets, and that didn't work.
As you work with students, as you work with companies, as people come up to you after you speak and you talk to them, what are some of the really common blind spots you see?
Right. I think one of the main things working with the client is to help them overcome really the resistance to doing it differently, especially in learning and development. So we have a lot of people who, well, hey, we were always taught that you need to give the learning objectives first. And then we were taught you had to tell the terminology first. And then we were taught you have to do this. So it's a very linear process that they're used to in terms of developing the instruction. But the problem with that is it's just kind of shoving it down people's throats, and it's not really engaging the learners. So the manager says, yeah, they need to learn this. They'll do it because it's part of their job. But just because something's part of your job doesn't mean you're going to enthusiastically embrace it, or you're going to try to find, the interesting areas of it and make it resonate. And I think one of the things, applying game thinking is to use those tools to make it resonate with the learners.
If you're going to give one piece of advice to, say, a client who wanted to work with you and wanted to do a really smart project and do something where you would be working at the peak of what you can do, and you want to give them advice about how to frame their issue and how to think about it, what would you tell them?
So I would tell them to start backwards. So I would say, look, what is the performance you want to elicit out of your employees? And then how do you think that the employees that do that learn to do that skill and how they do that skill well? And I would love to have the time to do a detailed task and cognitive analysis of what the experts do in that particular field, and then develop the experience based on that, based on backwards. Far too many times I find managers and everything, they kind of start with, training is the problem, or the employees don't know enough, or whatever. And often that's not the case. Sometimes it's an environmental issue. Sometimes I've been in cases where, so we worked with a government agency one time, and they found out that everyone in this one district who was on, it was a welfare agency, who was on welfare, was illiterate. And so they wanted us to create some training to help these people on welfare become literate. And so one of the first things we did, we went to that office and we said, okay, what's the process? Like, how do you intake a client? And they're going through, and then we're watching this woman click through screens, and we said, what's that on that screen? She goes, I don't know, but when I put this code in, it allows me to skip 3 screens. We're like, oh, okay. So we go back and we find out the code she was putting in and all our colleagues were putting in was for illiteracy. So this whole district.
Oh, that's too good. Oh my God.
Wasn't that amazing? Yeah, it was totally just a process. So that whole district, these people weren't illiterate. It was just the easiest code to skip 3 screens.
Oh my God. They were hacking the system.
So starting at the end and then actually doing an analysis to find out what's really going on and not making an assumption about what's going on. That would be my ideal work state, to be able to do the cognitive and task analysis.
Yeah. And just that framework of articulating and then testing your assumptions, so powerful. So where are you getting your inspiration these days? What trends are you following? What's on your mental horizon?
So, well, one thing I'm actually really kind of excited about is in the learning and development industry, how serious games and learning games are finally taking off. There's been decades of talking about serious games and learning and development. Like we would say 5 years ago in the corporate space, like the word game was a 4-letter word. And now it's much more acceptable. So I'm really excited about that. But I also look to people, who are, when I do learning games, that's different than doing, entertainment games. So I look to the people who are creating like really exciting entertainment games and kind of seeing what they do and seeing if there's anything we can borrow kind of in the learning space. I'm a huge fan of Assassin's Creed series. So I'm like, okay, anything I can steal from that series, I get a lot of inspiration from.
I think your students are very lucky to have you as their teacher.
Thank you.
So this is wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. And we will make sure that your books are available to everybody, and you should all check those out. All right, thanks.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Talk to you soon. Hey, innovator, wondering what innovation advice you should follow? It turns out that one size does not fit all. Take our Innovators quiz and get your free customized cheat sheet packed with smart innovation tips that are tailored to you. Go to gamethinking.io/quiz to get started.